What if we told you that the men who guarded Adolf Hitler, his personal SS bodyguards, the ones who stood outside the bunker doors as the Third Reich collapsed, did not all die in that bunker? That some of them vanished into the ruins of Berlin, others were hunted by Allied forces, and a few sat across from war crimes investigators, spilling secrets no one was supposed to hear. One of them ended up working as a mechanic, another became a spy asset, and one took his own life before the Soviets could make him talk. These were the men who watched history burn from the front row on May 1st, 1945. Just one day after Adolf Hitler's death, Berlin is officially in Soviet hands. The Führerbunker, once the nerve center of the collapsing Third Reich, is now just a strategic curiosity. But inside that bunker had been a small circle of men, Hitler's personal bodyguards, who witnessed the final moments of Nazi Germany from close range. What happened to them next is not widely known. In today's video, we are going to explore what happened to Adolf Hitler's bodyguards after World War II. These were men drawn from three primary units: the SS Begleitkommando, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD, and the Führerbegleitkommando, FBK. They were responsible for protecting Hitler at close range, guarding his residences, escorting his motorcade, and eventually standing watch over the bunker as the war ended. After Germany's surrender, these men were scattered. Some were captured by the Soviets or Americans, some were interrogated at length. A few faced trial, and others quietly reintegrated into post-war society, often under the radar. In this video, we'll look at the structure and roles of each guard unit, the key individuals involved, such as Rochus Misch, Otto Günsche, Heinz Linge, Wilhelm Mohnke, Erich Kempka, and Bruno Gesche. What became of them during the immediate aftermath of Hitler's death, how they were treated by Allied powers, and what we now know about their post-war lives through memoirs, interviews, and declassified documents. This is a story of how Hitler's innermost security ring dissolved after 1945, and where they ended up in the years that followed. So let's begin with who were Hitler's bodyguards. SS Begleitkommando, Hitler's original guard, 1932 to 1945. The story of Hitler's bodyguards begins not in the grand halls of the Reich Chancellery, but on the streets of Bavaria in the early 1930s. At that time, Adolf Hitler was not yet the all-powerful dictator of Germany. He was the leader of a growing but still volatile political movement. His life was constantly under threat from political enemies, communists, and rival paramilitary factions. To protect him during public appearances and political rallies, the Nazi Party leadership created a small personal protection unit within the SS. This unit was formed in early 1932 and consisted of just 8 men. It was initially known as the Stoßtrupp Adolf Hitler, and later renamed the SS Begleitkommando des Führers, Hitler's escort command. These men were handpicked for their loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi cause. They were SS men, fiercely dedicated and trusted, who were expected to protect Hitler with their lives. This small group of SS guards would follow Hitler everywhere, to speeches, train rides, car journeys, and meetings. Their job was simple but dangerous: protect Hitler from harm at all costs. It was from this small seed that Hitler's larger security apparatus would eventually grow. These men would serve as the prototype for future bodyguard units, setting the precedent for the kind of elite protection force Hitler would rely on throughout his reign. One of the first commanding officers of this unit was SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Gildisch, who led the group during 1933 and 1934. Gildisch had joined the SS in its early days and was considered reliable and politically dependable. However, internal power struggles and issues with alcohol abuse would later see him sidelined. By spring of 1934, a significant shift occurred. Responsibility for Hitler's outer protection was transferred to the Führerschutzkommando, FSK, a Bavarian police formation under Himmler's influence. The SS Begleitkommando, however, remained in place for inner protection, forming Hitler's close proximity security detail. While the FSK handled perimeter security at rallies and venues, the Begleitkommando ensured that no one got physically close to Hitler without authorization. During this period, SS Untersturmführer Bruno Gesche rose in prominence. He eventually took command of the unit and became a key figure in Hitler's inner security circle. Gesche was one of the few people who regularly interacted with Hitler in informal settings, joining him for tea, walks, or briefings. He was known for his loyalty, but also had a reputation for arrogance and reckless behavior, which would later cause him trouble. The SS Begleitkommando continued to serve as Hitler's inner guard throughout the 1930s, even as the Nazi state expanded. They were present during state visits, military parades, and Hitler's frequent travels across Germany and Europe. They also served as a personal connection between Hitler and his public appearances, sometimes riding alongside him in convoys and even managing private appointments. However, as the war progressed, the structure of Hitler's protection services evolved. In 1939, the expanding complexity of wartime security led to the creation of the Führerbegleitkommando, FBK, a larger and more structured SS bodyguard unit that absorbed many responsibilities from the original Begleitkommando. At the same time, another unit, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD, was tasked with coordinating overall security measures, including travel planning, venue scouting, and threat analysis. With these organizational changes, the original SS Begleitkommando was slowly phased out. Some of its members transitioned into the FBK or the RSD, while others were reassigned elsewhere in the SS. By the early 1940s, the Begleitkommando no longer existed as an independent unit. However, its legacy persisted through the men who remained within Hitler's inner guard. The end of the war in 1945 brought chaos for all remaining Nazi personnel, and the veterans of the Begleitkommando were no exception. Many of them were still active in Hitler's final months, particularly those who had transferred to the FBK. Those caught in Berlin during the Soviet siege either attempted to escape or were captured. Kurt Gildisch, the early commander, had a turbulent end. After being dismissed from Hitler's service in the mid-1930s due to his drinking, he was later reassigned to the Waffen-SS. He was wounded on the Eastern Front and ultimately captured by Soviet troops during the final days of the Battle of Berlin on May 2, 1945. He was imprisoned by the Soviets and reportedly spent years in captivity before his eventual release. He died in 1956. Bruno Gesche, perhaps the most notable face of the Begleitkommando, had a more complex trajectory. In 1944, due to repeated clashes with other Nazi officials and accusations of misconduct, Himmler removed him from Hitler's bodyguard detail. He was demoted and reassigned to the Eastern Front as a punishment. Gesche managed to survive the war and avoided prosecution in the immediate post-war years. He lived a quiet life in West Germany and died in 1982, never publicly discussing his past in detail. Other unnamed members of the Begleitkommando were scattered across various SS units by 1945. Some died in battle, others were captured. A few may have assumed new identities in the chaos of post-war Europe. The fate of many remains uncertain due to the lack of surviving personnel records and the secrecy surrounding SS reassignments during the war's final phase. Historians now regard the SS Begleitkommando as a formative part of Hitler's early security system, but one that faded into the background as more complex organizations took over. Its members, though few in number, played a key role in shaping the nature of Hitler's personal protection and were closely connected to the dictator during critical moments of his rise to power. Their post-war lives illustrate the broader pattern of Nazi officials either vanishing into obscurity, facing justice, or escaping accountability altogether. While the FBK and RSD were more involved in the final months of the war and in the Berlin bunker itself, the original Begleitkommando's contribution was foundational. Today, what remains of the SS Begleitkommando is found in memoirs, trial records, and fragmentary files stored in Allied archives. Their story reminds us how a small, hand-picked group of loyal men could become part of a global catastrophe and then disappear back into the fog of post-war Europe. The SS Begleitkommando began as a modest escort unit, but by the time it was absorbed into other branches, it had laid the groundwork for a personal security model that influenced every phase of Hitler's dictatorship. Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD, the detective bodyguards, 1933 to 1945. While the SS Begleitkommando was a tight-knit group of loyal SS men, Hitler's protection also relied on a more professional, organized unit, the Reichssicherheitsdienst, or RSD. This group was not made up of political fanatics. Instead, they were mostly experienced police detectives. Their job was not to stay right next to Hitler, but to secure the areas around him, make sure no one brought hidden weapons or recording devices into his presence, and check who was allowed to see him. The RSD grew out of an earlier unit called the Führerschutzkommando, FSK, which was created in 1933 to protect Hitler outside Bavaria. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler took control and combined this group with top detectives from the Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, the German criminal police. The new organization was named the Reichssicherheitsdienst. While they wore SS uniforms and used SS ranks, the RSD was really a detective service that worked behind the scenes. There were two main security units for Hitler. The Führerbegleitkommando, FBK, stayed close to Hitler and acted like bodyguards. The RSD, however, guarded the outer layers, like sweeping hotel rooms or conference areas for bugs, checking identification and watching for spies or attackers. They were not as famous as the SS troops seen in Nazi rallies, but they were a vital part of keeping Hitler safe. The leader of the RSD from start to finish was Johann Hans Rattenhuber. He had been a detective in Munich before the Nazis came to power. Rattenhuber joined Hitler's security team early on and stayed with him until the end of the war. He managed RSD security at key sites like the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia, and later in Berlin. He was considered loyal and professional, trusted by both Himmler and Hitler. As the war went badly for Germany and the Soviets closed in, the RSD found itself with fewer resources and more danger. In April 1945, during the Battle of Berlin, RSD officers took up defensive positions around Hitler's bunker under the Reich Chancellery. Rattenhuber and a few of his men guarded the entrances to the bunker and helped manage the last visitors and internal traffic. By this point, the RSD was no longer checking hotel rooms or screening visitors. Their job had changed from intelligence and security planning to basic survival. They carried rifles and pistols ready to defend the bunker if needed. When Hitler killed himself on April 30th, 1945, Rattenhuber helped secure the area where the body was burned in the garden behind the Chancellery. 2 days later, on the 2nd of May, 1945, Rattenhuber and some surviving RSD members surrendered to Soviet troops. He was taken alive, unlike some of Hitler's other guards who were killed or committed suicide. The Soviets saw value in keeping Rattenhuber alive because he had detailed knowledge of Hitler's final days. Rattenhuber was brought to Moscow. There, he was interrogated for years. Soviet officials used his testimony to help reconstruct the last hours in the Führerbunker. His statements were also used as background information for the Nuremberg trials, although Rattenhuber himself was not put on trial. He gave detailed interviews describing Hitler's mental and physical state, his final meetings, and the moment of suicide. His information was seen as highly credible because he had been there the entire time. Although he was listed on early United Nations war crimes watch lists, no charges were brought against him. His role had been more about protection than participation in Nazi atrocities. Still, he was not released. The Soviets kept him in prison until 1955, 10 full years after the war had ended. When he was finally freed, he was allowed to return to East Germany. Rattenhuber's freedom did not last long. He died 2 years later in 1957. Some reports suggest that he remained under Soviet surveillance and was possibly still being questioned at the time of his death. Official records state that he died while still in Soviet custody, though the exact cause is not known. Other members of the RSD had different fates. Some were captured by the Western Allies, British or American forces, and were questioned briefly, because their jobs had focused on personal security and surveillance, and not military campaigns or concentration camps. Most RSD members were not seen as high-priority war criminals. Many were eventually released and went back to normal lives. Unlike the Waffen-SS, Gestapo, or other notorious Nazi units, the RSD was smaller and more obscure. They did not leave behind large records of crimes or famous commanders. This made it easier for many of them to blend into post-war society. By the early 1950s, the Reichssicherheitsdienst had quietly disappeared. It was not officially disbanded because the entire Nazi regime had collapsed, but as an organization, the RSD was gone. Its files were lost or destroyed. Its members were scattered. Its last leader, Johann Rattenhuber, had died in Soviet hands. In the end, the RSD was a professional bodyguard and internal security service that followed Hitler to the very end. Its officers were not frontline soldiers or concentration camp commanders, but detectives and guards who worked in the shadows. Their story is a lesser-known part of Nazi Germany's history, a group that helped protect Hitler but could not save him, and whose members quietly disappeared after the war. Today, the RSD is mostly remembered through intelligence files and post-war testimonies, especially those given by Rattenhuber. These accounts have helped historians understand what happened inside the bunker in those final days. But beyond that, the RSD remains a footnote, one more forgotten part of Hitler's doomed empire. Führerbegleitkommando, FBK, Hitler's escort squad, 1939 to 1945. As Adolf Hitler's power and paranoia grew during the 1930s, so too did the complexity of his personal protection. The early SS guards around him had been small in number, mainly consisting of trusted men from Bavaria. But by the time World War II broke out in 1939, Hitler decided he needed a closer, more specialized group of bodyguards that would not only protect him from assassination attempts, but would also serve as trusted companions in his day-to-day life. Out of this need came the formation of the Führerbegleitkommando, or FBK, which translates to the Führer Escort Command. The FBK was established just as Germany invaded Poland, marking the official start of World War II. The unit was handpicked from the ranks of the SS, especially Hitler's personal SS regiment, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, LSSAH. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were elite, loyal, and unwavering in their devotion to the Führer. As Hitler moved from his mountain retreat at the Berghof to Berlin and eventually to frontline headquarters like the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the FBK was always by his side. The key difference between the FBK and other protective units like the Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD, was proximity. The RSD handled perimeter security, guest vetting, and intelligence sweeps, often working a few steps or rooms away. The FBK, on the other hand, was the only group allowed to stand directly next to Hitler. They walked beside him during parades, accompanied him on train journeys, stood behind him during speeches, and even guarded his private quarters. Only FBK members were allowed to be armed in Hitler's immediate presence, an incredible sign of trust from a man known for his suspicion and control. From the earliest days, FBK duties were wide-ranging. They might act as bodyguards during public events, drivers during personal trips, or even assistants and valets when the situation called for it. During the 1936 Berlin Olympics and other propaganda-heavy events, FBK men sometimes wore civilian clothes or police uniforms to blend in with the surroundings. In peacetime, they looked like assistants. In wartime, they were security specialists, always armed and ready to respond to any threat. By the peak of the war, around 1942 to 1944, the FBK had grown to include approximately 30 to 40 men. They worked in rotating shifts, ensuring that a fresh and alert team was always close to Hitler. Unlike most other military or SS units, FBK members were not subjected to frequent turnover. This created a tight-knit group that Hitler came to know personally. He often remembered their names, spoke to them directly, and showed occasional gestures of kindness, a rare thing from a leader known more for his distance than warmth. Hitler trusted the FBK so much that he allowed them to carry their weapons at all times, even in his private quarters. He refused to have them searched before entering his presence, which was an exception to the rule. He believed their loyalty was absolute, and for the most part, it was. Most of these men stayed with him through the most trying parts of the war, including the final siege of Berlin. Several FBK members would later gain notoriety due to their presence in the Führerbunker during Hitler's final days. Among the most well-known were Heinz Linge, Hitler's personal valet, Rochus Misch, who served as the telephone operator and messenger, Erich Kempka, Hitler's chief chauffeur, and Hans Hermann Junge, who had also been married to Hitler's favorite secretary, Traudl Junge, before his death in 1944. These men not only performed their security duties, but also took care of mundane everyday needs, bringing meals, preparing clothes, or delivering messages. The FBK was closely tied with the RSD, especially during the war years. The two units formed an overlapping ring of security around Hitler. The FBK remained the inner circle, literally standing beside Hitler at all times, while the RSD handled logistics, communications, and surveillance just outside that core. Although the two groups often worked together, they remained distinct in their structure and command. The FBK reported more directly to Hitler's personal staff, while the RSD was part of Himmler's larger SS security apparatus. As the war turned against Germany and Allied forces closed in from all directions, Hitler moved into the Führerbunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. There, the FBK followed him, maintaining their guard duties in an increasingly desperate environment. From January 1945, the unit was led by SS Obersturmbannführer Franz Schädler. He had risen through the ranks and was known for his discipline and loyalty. As commander, he tried to maintain order and morale even as Berlin was reduced to rubble. Inside the bunker, FBK men worked in tight conditions, often rotating between security posts, courier duties, and guarding entrances. Many of them knew the war was lost, but continued their duties out of habit, loyalty, or fear of desertion. Hitler became more withdrawn and irritable in those final months, but he never stopped trusting the FBK. They remained the only people permitted near him without constant supervision. On 30 April 1945, the world inside the bunker changed forever. Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the early afternoon. Afterward, several FBK members helped prepare and carry out the burning of Hitler's body in the garden outside the Chancellery. Schädler, despite being severely wounded in the leg and barely able to walk, stayed behind to manage what remained of the defense. His leg injury had become infected and was likely gangrenous. Realizing escape was no longer possible and unwilling to be captured, Schädler took his own life on 2 May 1945 with a pistol shot. His suicide effectively ended the leadership structure of the FBK. In the chaos that followed Hitler's death, the remaining FBK members split up. Some joined breakout groups that tried to flee the Soviet encirclement and reach the American or British zones. A few, like Heinz Linge and Rochus Misch, were captured by Soviet troops outside the bunker. Others, like Erich Kempka, managed to surrender to American forces. Richard Schulze Kossens, a high-ranking officer who had helped organize the FBK earlier in the war, made it to Czechoslovakia before surrendering to US troops. However, he was eventually handed over to the Soviets and remained in captivity until his death in 1988. Most FBK members did not face war crimes trials. They were seen by the Allies as part of Hitler's personal entourage rather than political or military leaders. As such, they were often interrogated and then sent to prisoner of war camps. Some were released as early as 1946, while others, particularly those captured by the Soviets, spent years in captivity. Rochus Misch, for example, was imprisoned in the Soviet Union for nearly a decade before being released. After the war, the FBK simply vanished as a unit. Without a central organization or command structure, there was nothing to maintain. Survivors either returned to civilian life, changed their identities, or faded into obscurity. Unlike other Nazi organizations such as the Gestapo or Waffen-SS, the FBK was relatively small, with fewer than 50 members at its peak. This made it easier for its former members to avoid the spotlight or reinvent themselves in post-war Europe. Very few FBK veterans wrote memoirs or gave interviews. Rochus Misch became one of the few exceptions, publishing his account in later life. Others, like Heinz Linge, also wrote about their experiences, but most chose to remain silent. Historians who have studied Hitler's security detail often comment on how little is known about the full FBK roster or their activities beyond what was documented in the final weeks of the war. In essence, the Führerbunker was the most trusted and intimate part of Hitler's protection system. These were the men who saw him at his most relaxed and his most desperate, who stood beside him during moments of triumph and collapse. They were not political leaders or military strategists. They were bodyguards, aides, and loyal servants. And as the Third Reich collapsed around them, the FBK dissolved alongside it. The story of the FBK is one of loyalty, proximity, and eventual erasure. Their final days were marked by suicide, surrender, or silent retreat. And with the death of Franz Schädler and the fall of Berlin, the Führerbunker disappeared into history, remembered only in the shadows of a dying regime. Rochus Misch, the last witness. One man bridged the gap between Hitler's bunker and our era, Rochus Misch. Misch joined Hitler's SS Guard in 1937 and became his telephone operator and bodyguard in the bunker. He was present from the final days onward and, remarkably, survived. On 2 May 1945 at dawn, he climbed out of the Führerbunker through a basement window. He later recalled the surreal scene outside. "I come out of this bunker of death, all that drama, and someone's playing music," he told Der Spiegel, describing how he saw 2 French soldiers playing Hawaiian guitar in a subway station. In that moment, the war was over for Misch and for Hitler. Yet Misch's ordeal was far from over. He and a few other survivors, including Hitler's pilot Hans Bauer, managed to reach Berlin's Nordbahnhof train station. The city above had been turned into a smoldering skeleton. Bombed-out buildings stood like jagged teeth against the grey sky. Fires still crackled in some districts. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was now a wasteland under Soviet control. Soviet patrols were everywhere, searching for Nazi officials, looters, and German soldiers in hiding. It was at Nordbahnhof that Misch and the others were arrested by a Red Army unit. He had tried to blend in, dressing in civilian clothes, but his SS identity could not be hidden for long. Misch, exhausted, malnourished, and emotionally hollow, still managed to care for the severely wounded Hans Bauer. Bauer had been shot in the leg, and his condition worsened daily. Misch used whatever cloth he could find to bandage the wounds and helped carry Bauer through the ruins. But it was a temporary reprieve. Once Soviet officials identified Bauer and discovered Misch had been in Hitler's personal service, the charade ended. On May 5, 1945, Rochus Misch was separated from the group and taken to Moscow. There, he disappeared into the infamous Soviet prison system. His captors were not ordinary Soviet soldiers, but agents of Stalin's dreaded NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Misch was of immense interest to them, not for who he was personally, but for what he knew. Stalin wanted every detail about Hitler's final moments. The Soviet leader, famously paranoid, was not convinced that Hitler had died in the bunker. Some rumors said he had escaped to Spain or Argentina. The West's intelligence agencies had similar doubts for years afterward. So the Soviets interrogated Misch relentlessly. He was questioned day and night, with little food and barely any sleep. In later interviews, Misch recalled being beaten, starved, and denied even basic hygiene. The interrogators wanted a confession, or at least a story they could use, but Misch insisted on the truth. He had seen Hitler dead. He had seen the body burned with gasoline. He described how Eva Braun's lifeless form lay nearby, how Joseph Goebbels wept as he confirmed Hitler's death, how Martin Bormann tried to take command. Yet no matter how detailed his account, the Soviets refused to believe him. Misch told Spiegel that the torture became unbearable. At one point, he was so broken that he wrote a letter to Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's ruthless intelligence chief, asking for execution. "Please, just shoot me," he pleaded. But the Soviets did not oblige. Instead, they kept him alive, barely. What followed were 8 long years of captivity. Misch was transferred from prison to prison, often in cold, desolate locations. He spent time in the labor camps of Kazakhstan, where he endured temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius in the winter. Prisoners slept on wooden boards and were often assigned to dig roads or cut timber with barely any food. Later, he was sent to camps in the Ural Mountains, where his health deteriorated further. He contracted various illnesses and suffered from recurring malnutrition. Like many German POWs in the Soviet system, Misch was considered a war criminal regardless of his individual actions. His SS uniform had sealed his fate. It was only after Stalin's death in 1953 that conditions began to change. The new Soviet leadership, under Nikita Khrushchev, gradually released many of the remaining German prisoners. Rochus Misch was finally among them. After 8 years of brutal captivity, he was allowed to return to Germany. He arrived in a country divided, Berlin itself split by ideology and a looming wall. Misch settled in the western part of the city, where he tried to live a quiet life. For many years, he ran a small painting and interior decoration business. He married and had a daughter. To the outside world, he appeared like any other Berlin tradesman. Few people knew that he had once stood only meters from Adolf Hitler on the day the dictator took his life. But time could not erase Misch's past, and neither did he try to. In the 1990s and 2000s, Misch gave interviews, participated in documentaries, and eventually published his memoir, Ich war Hitlers Telefonist, as I was Hitler's telephone operator, in 2008. He described life in the bunker in astonishing detail. The claustrophobia, the smell of diesel and sweat, the sound of gunfire growing louder each day, and the resignation in Hitler's voice as the end approached. Misch's tone in these accounts was always clinical, matter-of-fact, and occasionally tinged with loyalty. What disturbed many historians and journalists was not the information Misch shared, but the way he shared it. He never condemned Hitler. In interviews with The Guardian and Der Spiegel, he described the Nazi leader as the boss, not as a tyrant or criminal, but as a human being. He was no brute, Misch said. He was no monster, no Superman. He was the boss. That statement summed up his perspective, deeply personal, unapologetic, and disconnected from the vast horror Hitler had unleashed. To some, this made Rochus Misch a problematic figure, more loyal servant than regretful witness, but to historians he remained valuable. Misch was not just the last living person from Hitler's inner circle. He was a man who had seen the fall of the Third Reich from inside its heart. His memory offered insights no document could replicate. He recalled Goebbels' children playing in the corridors. He described Eva Braun brushing her hair just hours before her death. He was there when the final orders were issued, and when the world Hitler built collapsed into rubble. On 5 September 2013, Rochus Misch died in Berlin at the age of 96. By then, nearly every other figure connected to Hitler was long dead. Misch's passing marked the end of an era, not just the Nazi era, but the era of direct human memory of Hitler's final hours. With his death, the last eyewitness to the most secretive bunker in history was gone. The door to that past finally closed, leaving behind only his words, his memories, and the long, painful silence he carried through most of his life. He had emerged from the bunker into a broken world, seen his country divided, and spent his old age walking the same streets he had once passed in an SS uniform. The survivor of a regime that killed millions, Rochus Misch lived quietly, but his story echoes loudly, reminding us that even in the shadows of history, human voices still speak. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet in captivity. Of all the men who served in Hitler's inner circle, few had such intimate daily access to the Führer as Heinz Linge, the personal valet who attended to Hitler's every need, from the mundane to the morbid. Linge had been at Hitler's side since 1935, dressing him, managing his routine, and accompanying him during critical moments of the war. He was not just a servant, but a silent observer of history's most infamous man. His final days in the Führerbunker and the years of suffering that followed offer a harrowing glimpse into the price paid by those closest to Hitler. On 30 April 1945, the day Hitler took his life in the Führerbunker, Linge stood just outside the room as the fatal shot echoed. Moments later, he helped carry the Führer's lifeless body, alongside SS adjutant Otto Günsche, through the narrow hallways and out into the bombed-out garden behind the Reich Chancellery. There, under the hiss of Soviet shells raining down on Berlin, Linge poured petrol over the corpse and set it ablaze, fulfilling Hitler's explicit final wish to avoid the fate of Mussolini. It was a grim, unforgettable task. In the chaos of Berlin's collapse, Linge tried to escape. Wounded in the leg during the breakout attempt, he managed to flee the bunker on 1st May, accompanied by others, including Rochus Misch. The group made it out of the Chancellery grounds and reached the area near the Lehrter Bahnhof railroad tunnel. But Linge's brief flight to freedom ended the very next day. On 2 May 1945, he was captured by advancing Soviet troops. From that moment on, Heinz Linge entered a different kind of nightmare. Linge, like the rest of Hitler's surviving staff, was taken to Moscow. There, in the heart of Stalin's secret police headquarters at Lubyanka Prison, his body and spirit were put to the test. The NKVD was obsessed with a single question. Had Hitler truly died in the bunker? Stalin himself reportedly refused to believe Hitler was dead. Thus began a campaign of systematic torture designed to extract a confession, real or imagined. Linge was stripped naked, beaten until his skin turned purple, and held in stress positions for hours. The interrogators slapped him, whipped him, and shouted lies in his face. Linge was stripped naked, beaten until his skin turned purple, and held in stress positions for hours. The interrogators slapped him, whipped him, and shouted lies in his face. They accused him of being part of a conspiracy to fake Hitler's death and demanded he reveal the Führer's supposed escape route. But Linge refused to bend. Over and over, he insisted on the same account. Adolf Hitler shot himself on 30 April 1945. I burned his body. His stubborn consistency infuriated his captors, but it also corroborated the testimonies of other detainees. Historian Roger Moorhouse later affirmed Linge's story as one of the most reliable versions of Hitler's death. Still, the Soviets needed a scapegoat. In 1946, without any trial or formal process, Linge was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in the gulags for alleged war crimes, a punishment that had less to do with what he did and more with who he had served. Linge spent years in Soviet captivity, enduring forced labor, cold barracks, and psychological torment. But in 1955, after a diplomatic agreement between the Soviet Union and West Germany, he was granted amnesty along with thousands of other German POWs. After nearly a decade behind bars, he was allowed to return home. Back in West Germany, Linge settled in the northern city of Bremen, where he lived quietly, never seeking the limelight. Unlike some of Hitler's former aides who courted controversy and attention in their later years, Linge chose anonymity. Only in his final years did he begin to reflect publicly on his wartime service. He wrote a memoir, With Hitler to the End, which offered one of the most detailed and chilling eyewitness accounts of life inside the Führerbunker during the Third Reich's final days. Heinz Linge died on the 9th of March 1980, nearly 35 years after the collapse of the Nazi regime. His legacy was not one of ideology or loyalty, but of memory, a window into the bunker's final hours, preserved by a man who saw the flames consume the most feared figure of the 20th century. Otto Günsche, the adjutant interrogated. If Heinz Linge was Hitler's shadow, Otto Günsche was his shield. As an SS Sturmbannführer and the Führer's personal adjutant, Günsche was responsible for Hitler's physical security, schedule, and communication. But in the final days of the war, his duties went far beyond logistics. Günsche was one of the men who physically disposed of Hitler's corpse. His loyalty to the Führer followed him not just to the end of the war, but far beyond it, deep into the cold, dark cells of Soviet captivity. Günsche, born in 1917, was handpicked for his role due to his military precision and SS training. By 1944, he was often by Hitler's side and, during the last weeks of the war, lived in the Führerbunker. On the 30th of April 1945, as Berlin crumbled above their heads, he stood with Linge and others outside the room where Hitler and Eva Braun had sealed their fates. Minutes later, he was ordered to burn the bodies, ensuring the Soviets could not parade Hitler's remains through Red Square. On 2 May 1945, just hours after completing this grisly task, Otto Günsche surrendered to Soviet forces near the government quarter in Berlin. Unlike many other SS officers, he did not resist or flee. Perhaps he knew there was no point. The Soviets, however, had plans for him. Like Linge, Günsche was flown to Moscow, where Stalin had ordered the highest priority interrogation of all Hitler's inner circle. He was detained at Lubyanka Prison, the same grim fortress where confessions were extracted through pain, sleep deprivation, and humiliation. Alongside him were other bunker survivors: Heinz Linge, Rochus Misch, Erich Kempka, Traudl Junge, and Christa Schröder. The Soviets believed that within this circle lay the truth, or a useful fiction, about Hitler's fate. They demanded confirmation of whether the body found was real or a decoy, whether a secret escape route had been used, and whether Hitler had fled to Argentina or beyond. Günsche, like the others, stuck to the truth. Hitler is dead. He took his life on the 30th of April. Under duress, Günsche also provided a wealth of information about Hitler's final days, habits, mental condition, and interactions with staff. His interrogations were meticulously documented by the NKVD and eventually compiled into a secret Soviet report titled The Hitler Book, which was completed in 1949 for Stalin's personal use. For decades, this document remained hidden behind the Iron Curtain, a classified psychological profile of the Third Reich's dying breath. Despite being neither charged nor tried by the Western Allies, Günsche remained imprisoned for 11 years. He was held in Bautzen Prison, a notorious detention facility used by the East German Stasi after the war. There, in isolation, he endured years of bleak existence, denied the basic recognition that he was no longer a threat or criminal. Finally, on the 2nd of May 1956, exactly 11 years to the day after his surrender, Otto Günsche was released as part of a broader repatriation of German prisoners. He returned to West Germany, where the Cold War political landscape had changed dramatically, and ex-Nazis were quietly being reintegrated into society. Unlike some of his counterparts, Günsche kept a low profile. He never gave flamboyant interviews, never spoke at length about ideology, and refused to become a public voice for revisionism. He chose discretion. His participation in Hitler's final hours remained a heavy burden, something he acknowledged quietly but rarely expanded upon. Otto Günsche died of heart failure on 2 October 2003 in Lohmar, Germany. He was 86 years old. At the time of his death, he was one of the last surviving members of Hitler's inner circle, and with him died yet another first-hand voice of the bunker's final tragedy. Wilhelm Mohnke, Berlin's last stand. Wilhelm Mohnke was one of the most loyal men in Hitler's inner circle. He had served the Nazi Party from its early days, and by the end of the war, he was a powerful SS general. In April 1945, when Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin, Mohnke was chosen to defend the government district, which included the Reich Chancellery and the Führerbunker. Hitler placed a lot of trust in him. Mohnke was in charge of about 2,000 soldiers, SS guards and some civilians who were trapped in the center of Berlin. His unit was called Kampfgruppe Mohnke. Mohnke had a long history with the Nazi Party. In fact, he was one of Hitler's original bodyguards back in 1933. He had climbed the SS ranks over the years and commanded a unit at Berchtesgaden, one of Hitler's favorite homes. Despite being wounded in the leg during the last days of April, Mohnke stayed at his post. When Hitler died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, Mohnke was still holding the line in the ruined capital, refusing to surrender until he had no other choice. After Hitler's death, Mohnke received permission to try a breakout. He gathered his remaining men and some civilians from the bunker. They planned a dangerous escape across Soviet lines, hoping to reach the Western Allies or escape into hiding. The breakout attempt began on the 1st of May, but it was quickly met with heavy Soviet fire. The group was scattered, and by 2 May 1945, Mohnke and his men were captured near an S-Bahn train station in central Berlin. His part in the defense of the Chancellery was over. The Soviets were eager to question anyone who had been close to Hitler during those final days. Like many others, Mohnke was flown to Moscow. There, he was placed in Lubyanka Prison, the same feared building where the Soviet secret police interrogated thousands of prisoners. Mohnke stayed in Soviet custody for 10 long years, passing through different prisons, including one that held captured generals. The Soviets never officially charged Mohnke with any war crimes, but they were interested in what he knew about Hitler, the final battles in Berlin, and the Nazi leadership. Finally, in October 1955, Mohnke was released as part of a general amnesty. He returned to West Germany after a full decade in prison. By this time, the world had changed. The war was long over, and many former Nazis had managed to reintegrate into normal life. Mohnke quietly settled in Hamburg and started working as a truck dealer. He avoided the media and never made any public statements about his time in the bunker or about his role in Hitler's government. But Mohnke's name did not disappear entirely. In the 1960s, investigators in West Germany began looking into his actions during the war. One of the most serious accusations was that Mohnke had ordered the killing of British prisoners of war in 1940 during the fall of France. This event became known as the Wormhout Massacre. Later, in Normandy in 1944, there were also claims that Canadian soldiers had been executed by SS units under his command. Although his name was linked to these events, no hard evidence was ever found to prove he gave any direct orders to carry out these crimes. British members of Parliament even asked questions about him in 1988. They wanted to know why Mohnke had never been put on trial. Some documents showed that his name had been placed on a United Nations war crimes list in the late 1940s. But when West German prosecutors opened investigations, they could not find any firm proof. Mohnke always denied the charges. He insisted he had never given orders to kill prisoners and told historians he had followed military law during the war. Despite the serious nature of the accusations, Mohnke was never prosecuted. In many ways, his case shows how difficult it was to hold former Nazis accountable after the war. Many of them, like Mohnke, blended back into society in the 1950s and lived quiet lives. Without clear evidence or witnesses, trials became nearly impossible. Mohnke lived for several more decades. He rarely spoke to the press, though he did give a few interviews in his later years. In those, he admitted that the final days in Berlin were full of chaos, fear, and confusion. But he stuck to his claim that he had committed no war crimes. He died on the 6th of August 2001 in Barsbüttel, a small town near Hamburg, at the age of 90. He was one of the last surviving generals from Hitler's bunker. Wilhelm Mohnke's story shows how the end of the war was not the end of the story for many senior Nazis. Some were tried and executed, others escaped justice entirely. Mohnke landed somewhere in between, questioned and accused but never convicted. His peaceful life after release was a sharp contrast to the violent legacy of the regime he served. Erich Kempka, Hitler's chauffeur. Erich Kempka may not have been a high-ranking general, but he had a front-row seat to history. As Hitler's personal chauffeur, Kempka was part of the Führer's daily life for over a decade. He drove Hitler's famous black Mercedes, ran the motor pool for the Nazi leadership, and often transported key figures to and from the Reich Chancellery. By the end of April 1945, Kempka was still loyal to Hitler, though the situation was clearly collapsing all around him. On 30 April, after Hitler died by suicide, Kempka was one of the men responsible for helping carry Hitler's body out of the bunker. He helped douse the corpse with gasoline and set it on fire, following Hitler's own instructions. For years after the war, Kempka would say that this was the most surreal and terrifying moment of his life. In the chaos that followed, Kempka made one final trip in a tank toward the bunker, trying to find other survivors or plan an escape. But it became obvious that the battle for Berlin was lost. So, like many others, Kempka decided to flee westward. He did not want to fall into Soviet hands, knowing that they were arresting and torturing anyone close to Hitler. Instead, Kempka tried to reach the American lines. After several weeks on the run, Kempka was captured by US forces at Berchtesgaden, one of Hitler's old mountain retreats, on June 20th, 1945. Unlike the Soviets, the Americans treated him more like a witness than a war criminal. They interrogated him, mostly to gain information about Hitler's movements, the bunker staff, and the final days of the Third Reich. Kempka spoke openly, confirming details that matched what other captured Nazis had already said. The Americans did not hold him for long. He was never charged with any crimes and did not face a formal trial. After 2 years in custody, Kempka was released in 1947 and returned to life in post-war West Germany. For a while, he lived quietly and stayed out of the public eye. But in 1951, he decided to publish his memoir. The book was called I Was Hitler's Chauffeur. It was one of the first detailed first-hand accounts of Hitler's personal life and behavior in the final months of the war. Kempka described what it was like driving Hitler, being part of the motor pool, and witnessing events from just a few feet away. His memoir included dramatic stories, some of which publishers emphasized to sell more copies. Later, Kempka would say that not all of the book's content reflected how he truly remembered things. Still, the memoir became an important source for historians trying to piece together the truth about Hitler's final days. After the publication, Kempka slipped back into private life. He remarried, worked several jobs, and avoided public controversy. He was never questioned during the post-war denazification process and remained free for the rest of his life. While other bunker survivors gave interviews or sought attention, Kempka seemed content to let his memoir speak for itself. He died on 24th of January 1975 in the town of Freiburg, West Germany. By that time, very few people from Hitler's personal staff were still alive or willing to talk publicly. Kempka's book remained one of the few direct testimonies available about the Führerbunker, Hitler's habits, and the eerie atmosphere of the last days of the Nazi regime, others, and the collective legacy. While much attention has been given to the most well-known figures in Hitler's inner circle, such as Wilhelm Mohnke, Erich Kempka, Rochus Misch, and Heinz Linge, the story of those who guarded and served the Führer involves many others. These men, often less famous, played their roles in the Nazi regime's final chapter and faced varied fates after the war. Their collective legacy is complex and often overlooked, yet it reveals much about the nature of loyalty, justice, and survival during and after one of history's darkest times. One example is Bruno Gescher. Gescher was an early member of Hitler's personal bodyguard and spent the war years guarding Hitler's Berghof in the Bavarian Alps and his residence in Berlin. Despite falling out of favor and being dismissed from the Führerbegleitkommando, FBK, Hitler's personal escort unit, in late 1944, Günsche survived the war without being prosecuted for war crimes or facing serious consequences. He lived quietly in post-war Germany, dying peacefully in Hanover in 1982. Günsche's story reflects how some of Hitler's guards managed to escape harsh punishment, blending back into ordinary life. Similarly, Karl Wilhelm Krause, who served as Hitler's valet driver in the 1930s before being replaced, was captured by the French towards the war's end. He spent a few years in captivity, but was released in 1947 and lived out the rest of his life in obscurity until his death in 1959. Unlike some of his comrades who wrote memoirs or gave interviews, Krause disappeared from public view, leaving little trace of his experiences behind. This quiet retreat from history is typical of many lower-ranking members of Hitler's staff. Other FBK men, such as August Körber and Adolf Deer, were caught up in the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich and ended up in prisoner-of-war camps. They were released by 1946 and left no memoirs or public testimony. Their fate is harder to track, but their silence and anonymity hint at how many Nazi officials simply vanished from the historical record after the war, either by choice or circumstance. Not all those close to Hitler had peaceful ends. Some met tragic or violent deaths. Hans Rattenhuber, for example, was the brother of Johann Rattenhuber, the head of Hitler's Reichssicherheitsdienst, RSD, the security service responsible for protecting the Führer. Hans Rattenhuber himself continued to guard Hitler's new bunker in the woods during the last days of the war. When Berlin fell on the 30th of April 1945, Hans went down with the bunker and was declared killed in action. His death symbolizes the grim fate of many loyal Nazis who stayed with Hitler until the very end. Hans Hermann Junge also had a tragic fate. He was an SS lieutenant, Eva Braun's fiancé, and one of Hitler's personal bodyguards. Junge stood guard in the Führerbunker, but died earlier, in combat during April 1944, well before the final collapse of the Nazi regime. His death was a personal loss for Eva Braun, who remained with Hitler until their joint suicide in 1945. We also cannot forget the non-SS staff who were intimately involved in Hitler's final day. Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, survived the war and Soviet captivity. After being released, she moved to West Germany, where she published memoirs about her time working for Hitler. Her accounts offer a rare inside look at Hitler's personality and the atmosphere within the bunker. She passed away in 2002. Her writings remain valuable to historians as one of the few personal testimonies from inside the Führer's inner circle. Magda Goebbels' chauffeur, Kurt Steinbach, had a darker post-war story. He was arrested by Allied forces and committed suicide while in captivity. Steinbach's death underscores the despair and fear that many Nazi officials felt after the war as they faced the consequences of their roles in the regime. These examples show that not everyone who served Hitler was part of the SS security service. Some were personal staff, Wehrmacht adjutants, or civilians tasked with various duties within Hitler's immediate circle. Their experiences were varied, but all were deeply connected to the inner workings of the Third Reich's leadership. When we look at the collective fate of Hitler's inner security circle and staff, a clear pattern emerged. Virtually none were executed or served long sentences for war crimes. Many escaped serious charges altogether, often claiming that they were simply following orders or were unaware of the full extent of Nazi atrocities. This defense was commonly used by many accused Nazis and was difficult for prosecutors to disprove without concrete evidence. After the war, Allied and German authorities focused on prosecuting the highest-ranking Nazi leaders and the most notorious criminals. This left many of the lower-ranking officials and bodyguards unpunished. Investigations into individuals like Wilhelm Mohnke in the 1960s failed to produce sufficient evidence for prosecution. Other bodyguards, such as Rochus Misch and Heinz Linge, were occasionally interviewed by intelligence agencies, but these sessions were more for historical records than criminal trials. By the late 20th century, news reports still appeared occasionally, highlighting the survival of some of Hitler's last bodyguards. Headlines such as "Hitler's last bodyguard turns 90" reflected a fascination with these men's longevity rather than any legal reckoning. Their stories became more testimonials, a way for the world to connect with the past, rather than indictments of guilt. Morally and historically, the legacy of these men remains complicated. Some, like Rochus Misch and Heinz Linge, remained unapologetic about their loyalty to Hitler. Misch, for instance, spoke of Hitler in almost familial terms, even into old age. This proud loyalty, combined with their military discipline, may explain why many in the West were hesitant to prosecute them harshly. They were often viewed as soldiers doing their duty, rather than as active participants in Nazi crime. Others, like Linge and Kempke, quietly returned to civilian life after the war. Their silence in the years following 1945 was often interpreted as tacit denial or avoidance of responsibility. This reluctance to confront the past is a reminder of the many complexities involved in reckoning with the horrors of the Nazi era. By 2013, with the death of Rochus Misch, the last surviving member of Hitler's close personal staff, there were no more living first-hand witnesses to the final days in the Führerbunker. Historians today rely heavily on their memoirs, interviews, and wartime interrogations to understand those last moments of the Third Reich. These documents, while invaluable, also come with the limitations of memory, bias, and self-preservation. Looking back, the collective fate of Hitler's bodyguards and personal staff is a footnote in history, but an important one. Many of these men lived long lives after the fall of the Third Reich, yet they rarely lived in the spotlight. They slipped quietly into private lives, families, and ordinary jobs. Their survival was a stark contrast to the violent collapse of the regime they once served. These men were, above all, human beings caught in the catastrophic storm of history. Their stories remind us that even those closest to evil leaders are not always monsters, but often complex individuals shaped by loyalty, fear, duty, and circumstance. The shadow of their service remains, challenging us to remember and learn from the past while understanding the human dimension behind historical events. After all these journeys, from the cold interrogation rooms to quiet, anonymous suburbs, the guards of Hitler shared a final, striking common thread. Most lived out their days in obscurity or silence. The mighty Führerbunker emptied, the SS uniforms were shed, and the men who once stood at the heart of one of history's darkest regimes quietly disappeared from public view. As we have seen throughout this series, their fates varied widely. Some endured brutal interrogations, facing the weight of Allied justice. Others experienced only brief detentions before being released. And many were never arrested or questioned at all, slipping back into ordinary life without facing consequences. By 2013, with the death of Rochus Misch, Hitler's last living aide and bodyguard, only memories and written accounts remained to tell the story. Misch himself became a symbol of this entire generation of men. Loyal to his last breath, he famously insisted that Hitler was no monster, revealing how deeply some of these men clung to their personal loyalty, despite the horrors their leader orchestrated. This loyalty is a difficult legacy to unpack. On one hand, it helped them avoid harsh blame or punishment. On the other, it leaves us with a shadow of denial that complicates how we understand justice and responsibility. So, what can we learn from the lives of these men after the war? How does their quiet survival challenge the way we view history's villains? Were they simply soldiers caught in the tides of history, or something more? And perhaps most importantly, what does their story tell us about the nature of loyalty, complicity, and humanity in times of immense moral crisis? Their collective story, gathered here from archives, interviews, and memoirs, reveals how the collapse of a totalitarian regime scattered its guardians to the wind. These men faded quietly into the decades beyond World War II, living normal lives away from the spotlight. As we reflect on their legacy, we must ask ourselves, how do we remember the past when its protectors live among us, almost unnoticed? And how do we ensure history's darkest chapters are neither forgotten nor repeated?